Post-Mortem Studios, role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com. Well, I already recorded this once, but the sound didn't take for some reason, so let's try again. At least there'll be more practice this time around. We're talking about Tunnels and Trolls. Now, there's been a lot of games that have followed the Dungeons and Dragons name type. Very few of them have stuck around or lingered in the memory. Tunnels and Trolls is perhaps the exception. Now, it is very much an old school game, but it has a lot of ideas in it that will seem new and innovative. Perhaps part of the reason it got so much traction was because Tunnels and Trolls was as much a single-player game in choose-your-own-adventure books as it was a proper, fully-fledged RPG. From the get-go, you had plenty of books published by Corgi, here in the UK at least, the same people that brought us Dragon Warriors, Sagard, and others. You know, they really kind of went in on the role-playing thing at the time. I think this because Fighting Fantasy and so on was doing so well. But both TNT and Dragon Warriors were genuine, full-on RPGs, as well as being single-player adventures. I mean, some of these are notorious. Naked Doom is particularly notorious. The Josh Kirby artwork is particularly iconic and kind of makes Tunnels and Trolls in a lot of ways for a lot of people. The bulging muscles and boobies and so on, but in a slightly cartoonish and abstracted style. So yeah, Naked Doom was notorious. That's you start out completely naked of anything and trying to survive. We also have here the Amulet of the Salty and Arena of Kazan. Didn't Josh Kirby do the early Discworld novel covers? I think that was him. The Blue Frog Tavern, that's known quite well as well. You've got Gamesman of Kassar and Mistywood. City of Terror is also known to a lot of people. They weren't all done in this format. Some of them were done in full-size page formats. I've got a couple of those somewhere, but I couldn't find them in time for making this. But it's an old-school RPG, and a lot of it will seem familiar to anyone who's played any RPGs at all ever, or who started with D&D, but a lot is rather different and unique and special, and gives Tunnels and Trolls its own character, its own style, and without being too kind of overbearing about its background and so on. Where D&D became a bit more serious, I guess, and a bit more po-faced, and where it became very much weighed down by the background and the lore of Faerun or Athas and so on, TNT stayed largely abstract, and on the one side juvenile in a lot of its humour, in the way it approached fantasy by fantastical first rather than having it necessarily make any sense, but then it dealt with adult material occasionally, thanks Josh Kirby, in a bit more of a mature way, without getting quite so antsy as D&D did since the Monster Manual debacle with the demons and devils and succubi and so on. TNT didn't really seem to go into that trap. If you've got an edition of Tunnels and Trolls, it is broadly compatible with everything, and if you've got any of the single player books, it's perfectly simple to nick something out of them and bring it into the games. It's very broadly cross-compatible and hasn't changed very much over the years. Where that's a weakness in something like Palladium's games, it's very much a strength in Tunnels and Trolls, I think, because it kept things simple and it got things right from the get-go. It hasn't needed a huge amount of change. And it won't satisfy everyone. Some people will want to give different emphases and so on, but because it's not so codified in the same way that D&D is, there's plenty of room, there's plenty of scope for you to customize and add and remove without necessarily breaking the whole thing. So I got this anniversary edition that was actually out in 2015, but I'm a bit slow and haven't had the money for it for quite some time. I haven't played TNT half as much as I would like to, but I used to play these single-player adventures to death. And it's a shame, because it is a fun RPG. It's just my group's tastes and my tastes have tended to move towards more modern and less old-school games over time. But this is basically a collected edition of absolutely everything you could ever possibly need, almost, to run a Tunnels and Trolls game. It even has a world, which the previous editions of TNT didn't really have. But you can tell just by looking at it here. Yeah, there's a continent shaped like an eagle, there's a continent shaped like a unicorn, there's a continent shaped like a dragon, and so on. Yeah, the fantastical is front and centre. Now, the artwork throughout this book is a bit naive, I suppose you could say. It's a shame that there's not more Josh Kirby art in the book, but it does have a very old school kind of fanzine look, and a lot of this art is culled from earlier editions and other books. Just like I said, it's a shame there's not the Josh Kirby stuff in there. Some of you may not like that, others, it'll be a huge nostalgic deal for you. Now, it uses D6s, which helps make it accessible to lots of people. If you look at the character sheet, a lot of stuff is going to be at least broadly familiar to you. So, type, that's the kind of class you would have. Level doesn't quite work the same way as D&D, but as an idea of overall power level of a character, it's a good general guide. Kindred, race, height, weight, hair, strength, constitution, dexterity, those will all be familiar. Speed, slightly different. IQ for intelligence. Whiz for kind of magical power. Luck, charisma. Combat adds, we'll come to that in a bit. And so on. Yeah, a lot of that's familiar. It all uses D6s. You roll 3d6. That's going to be familiar to everyone. And this may lull you into a slightly false sense of familiarity with the game, though things are going to be broadly familiar. Now, ads. You take into account your statistics and your equipment and your weapons and so on, and that gives you ads. Now, when you get into combat, you roll the appropriate number of dice, you add your ads, and you pool that with the rest of the people in your party to create an overall party kind of combat effectiveness. And that may annoy some people, as it kind of abstracts things. You don't necessarily get to make your own individual heroic actions, though you can choose to if you want. But for keeping combat quick and simple, that is a really effective way of going about it. Party versus mob, party versus creature. It's quite elegant and simple, but if you want, you can still do individual attacks and you can still create individual monsters and so on. But each character gets to contribute something via their ads, which is an interesting way of going about things. There's only really 3 main character types: warriors, who fight; wizards, who cast spells; and rogues, who do a bit of both. They're kind of generalists. It's rogue in the more modern D&D sense, rather than thief. So there's the capacity for magic there, and you will miss out if you don't develop some magic on your rogue. Then there's specialists. Now those have been added to. Earlier editions didn't necessarily have so many specialists. I brought out a product called Specialists for Tunnels and Trolls. You can get that on post-mort.com or on DriveThruRPG if you want to look it up. TNT Specialists, I think it's listed under. So that will expand on those rules if you want. If you want more classes, if you want more capabilities. But you only get to be a specialist if you roll a triple on one of your statistics. And if you do roll a triple, you get to roll again and add on. So you can get characters that are ludicrously powerful in one specific arena, even as starting characters, and that opens up the options for specialists. So there are more classes than at first appears, but by and large there's 3 broad classes. Kindred is your race. So the basic ones are human, dwarf, elf, obviously. Fairies, which are little sprites. Not many games let you play tiny characters like that. I think Earthdawn does. can't think of many others, at least not as your basic rules. But in this, they're right there from the start. Hobbs, which is their version of halflings, leprechauns. Yeah, they're leprechauns. what more can you say about that? So you've got some conventional races, you've got some unconventional races. You can play monstrous races as well if you want. There's rules for that in the expanded information later on. So you're not purely limited by that. Different races have slightly different modifiers and slightly different capabilities. Let's pick fairies. Slightly complicated. When you roll your stats, you then multiply them by the amount shown here. Easy enough with a calculator. So if you rolled 12 strength for a fairy, you would multiply that by 0.25, which is the same as dividing by 4. So you would end up with a strength of 3 in that case. And so it goes for the rest of these stats. But then others are higher, so dexterity becomes 1.75, luck becomes 1.5, whiz is doubled, you know. So that's how it's worked out. It's slightly complicated, I guess, for some people, but it does really help create a sense of differential between the characters. And some of them have other little special abilities like flying or whatever else it might be. You got your height, weight, etc. there. You get your possessions sorted out. And the character level isn't exactly like, you don't necessarily progress from level 1 to level 2 by accumulating experience points. Rather, you progress by raising your stats and your talents and various other things, and then level is a way of measuring and scaling your overall level to the kinds of monsters and things that you might encounter. So it's a kind of description of what your character is rather than a definition of what your character is. So that kind of steps aside from what you might normally think of as level. So equipment here. You've got plenty of options for equipment, not quite the Gygaxian level of different spears and polearms and so on, but it's there. There's enough there to differentiate different weapons a bit, but because combat tends to get all lumped in together most of the time, unless you elect to do it as separate actions and so on, this is mostly about style. I guess, more than anything else. Some of them have some particular special abilities and so on. Ranged weapons tend to be handled separately to close combat weapons unless you decide to lump it all together. So when it comes to ranged weapons, your choice is a bit more important than it is with your other weapons. One thing Tunnels and Trolls has for a long time had going for it that D&D hasn't is that guns are very much brought in as part of the game, as part of the setting, as part of the system. So if you're aiming to play a fantasy game that is more clockpunk or early moderns, kind of Elizabethan onwards, I guess, then TNT is a pretty good bet for that kind of thing. And armor and shields, they reduce damage essentially. If you would take damage, you take that away from it first. An interesting aspect of combat is that when you and your group take damage, you can divide it out how you like. So if one of your characters is particularly heavily armoured, you could say that he takes the bulk of the damage, and that would also reduce how much the rest get. So there is a definite role for a heavily armoured tank in a game of TNT that doesn't necessarily exist in D&D. Yeah, it's a much more effective role, it's a much more useful role to play. And you got options for customizing your equipment, giving it bonuses, and so on. You've got your poison rules, all the kind of basics that you'd expect. Provisions, special equipment, coming up with a backstory about your adventure and so on. Now, another area in which it diverges from old editions of D&D certainly is the inclusion of skills and saving rolls. So saving roll is made against your statistic. It's determined by a level that gives it its target number. Yeah, and that determines whether you succeed or not. That also taps into the skills, talents system, which will give you bonuses on making saving checks in those particular areas. So this is a very broad and open way of determining whether a character succeeds when they try to do something skillful or whatever else. So you go into talents, and there's a good strong guide on them and a suggested list of talents. This is your skill substitute. You can't necessarily make a very skilled character from the get-go, which is a shame. I'd like it to be an option for rogues to sacrifice magic for more talents or something. I think that would work well, but over time, as you build up your character, you can invest in the talents and make them more powerful in that way. Now, when it comes to combat, I talked about adds and how you come together as a group, as a unit, as a party, and fight as a unit by combining all your adds and so on. That also opens up some great possibilities for the monsters that you might face. If you're an improvisational games master, as I am, and you just need a quick encounter with some low-level mobs, you can give the mob, as a whole, a monster rating, which determines how many dice it rolls in combat, and its adds. You can tack on some armor or whatever else, and some tactics, whatever you might want to do, and then you're good to go. And there's a natural death spiral built into that as the goblins or whatever it is that they're fighting get cut down one by one, or exhausted, or whittled down in other ways. So if you're an improvisational GM, that is a fucking godsend. For all it might detract from the possibility for characters to necessarily do individual heroic actions, there's no reason why you as a GM can't allow them to throw in their adds and also do some kind of heroic action. It does make combat swifter, it makes encounters easier to create, and like I say, that's just a godsend when you're a games master. In many ways, this whole idea presages the later development of the idea in a lot of games of having mooks, sort of cannon fodder, blade fodder, for you to just cut down and move your way through without too much inconvenience, and bosses, because you can also supplement your monster rating mob with a gang of, well, with individual bosses who have full attributes, full abilities, everything that you might otherwise have as a character. And you can have the two fight side by side, allow players to target the leader or whatever it might be. And it just works really well. One way in which I don't think this is particularly tapped into is its potential for very large scale combat, like armies. You could total the adds from a whole host of cavalry or whatever it might be, and resolve mass combat armies. Great battles in that way, though there'd be a lot of dice rolling. You could do that using an online dice roller or something, and that would be a lot easier. But that would be one way to handle that. And it's not something that's particularly explored in TNT itself, but it's the possibility is there. Because even if one side beats the other, you can still do a little bit of damage to the opposing side. So a unit or a team or a party can get worn down over time, even if they're killing it as they march through the enemy mobs. They can still get pulled down. So yeah, combat goes into these things that I've kind of already mentioned. As standard, you kind of club together and total up your adds, and you total up the enemy adds, and then you see what happens as a result of that. If you take damage, you can divide it amongst your party however you like, so that's where the tanks can come in and so on, or someone can make a heroic sacrifice for the sake of their friends. Missile attacks are by standard done separately, but you could roll them into the overall adds if you so wanted. That's also possible. Magic is also handled separately, but again, for combat magic, you could roll that in if you wanted to. There's all these options. If you want to just do the kind of generic group combat and leave it all up to the dice and just be descriptive, then you can. If you want to open things up, allow players to make special moves, special maneuvers, special stunts, target a particular enemy, or whatever else they want to do, there's no reason why you can't do that as well. the game is open enough and customizable enough that you can certainly do that, no problem. I would add a step into combat to allow people to describe what they're doing, or to perform a particular stunt, or whatever else it might be, or maybe they can replace their normal attack with a stunt or something. But then you as the GM, you need to be creative and figure out how that affects the flow of combat. But there's no reason why that couldn't work very well. They do consider that you can have saving roll effects to do special things during combat, so the consideration's there. Now, where TNT really kind of comes into its own and tells you what kind of game it is, sets the tone, sets the scene, all of that, is in its magic section. Now, magic is kind of innate and inherent to the standard setting, even though the earlier books never really set a setting. But magic flows through everything. I mean, you see that in the shape of the continents and everything. Everything has a kind of fantastical side to it. And TNT has always had its tongue thrust firmly into its cheek. And nowhere does this become more obvious than when it comes to spells and the names of them. So if we just take a quick look through the list here. Hocus Pocus is the name of a spell. Oh, Go Away is the name of a spell. Take That, You Fiend is probably the most notorious spell and phrase associated with Tunnels and Trolls, and that's a generic blast spell. But that just kind of, that tells you everything. It's just kind of cheeky and fun and Monty Hall, and it's very much in the tradition of the bad puns and everything from earlier D&D. It's the kind of game where you quote Python, and it's not just stereotypical and annoying for you to do so. I don't particularly like this layout, though. It must be said. We don't need to look at the rest of the spells there particularly. Oh, then it goes into magic items and things that you need to cast spells. You've got staves, wands, you've got potions, wards and trinkets, magical items, magical weapons, all the kind of typical stuff that you would normally expect to see. Power batteries for wizards; they can draw more magical spells from things. See, they've reused a load of art from the past, which is fine, and will help the nostalgia for a lot of people. This piece, 1989, Liz Danforth, for example. So then you've got a lot of advice, which is good for new DMs or games masters. I don't think there's going to be many new people picking up TNT who've never played anything before. But yeah, there's all the usual basic good advice that you can use there. Oh, more spells, listings. It's all very useful when you're looking stuff up, but not when you're reviewing. So then we move on to the elaboration section. So you could call this Advanced Tunnels and Trolls, I guess. This is where it expands all the various options you have. So training, more information on character types, more kind of ideas how you can expand on those things for them. Specific magic relating to particular race types. Some more ideas on rogues. And additional specialists that aren't described in the original rules. So strong one if you've got really high strength, ranger if you've got really high dexterity, martial artist if you've got really high speed, mastermind if you've got really high intelligence, mage if if you're specialized in magic, gambler if you've got luck, leader if you've got high charisma. And then they've got rules for citizens, your standard bog standard peasant or whatever. You could even play those as adventurers. And in some ways that might be a way to replicate the thief rather than the rogue in the sense that it's here. Paragons are what used to be called warrior wizards, and they're characters who are exceptional, truly exceptional, and can have the special powers of both warriors and wizards. You're not limited to those starting races. If you've got a race in a book, you can pretty much play it. But they've expanded to include what you might think of as being NPC or monster races. So you could play a centaur, or a gnome, or a goblin, or a kobold, or a skeleton, or a vampire, or a lizard man, or a giant. You know, the rules are all there. So if you wanted to go truly gonzo and fantasy cosmopolitan, allow people to play just about any race that they wanted, the option is most certainly there. Then it goes into stronger descriptions on the various creatures and things, which aren't... Some of them may sound familiar if you've played D&D, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same. Kobolds is probably the best example there. So kobolds in this game are more like dogs or cats. Kobolds tend to be the lizard-like or dog-like. I think in D&D of late they've been more related to dragons, whereas they're much more animalistic in this. So yeah, you've got all your options there. Language information if you care. Expanded rules for talents, so you can train up to higher levels from novice through apprentice and journeyman all the way to master. So if you want to play a more skill-oriented game, the option is there, and you could expand on talents. I would probably allow rogues to sacrifice their capacity to learn magic for additional talents or cheaper talents or something like that. So you could play a skilled rogue instead of a magical rogue. The conversion rules demonstrate how little TNT has had to change down the years. It's the 2.25 pages basically of conversion rules. More information about things you can use to play, treasure charts, how to mark time, different advantages and things, a little essay or conversation about dice, why they've stuck with using d6s rather than expanding out, different steeds that people can use, and armor for animals. Then we get into Troll World, which is their setting, which hasn't particularly been detailed in the past, but it's the world that we find in the single player books. I'm not particularly interested, to be honest, so I haven't spent a lot of time reading this, but it does seem to be a very fantastical world, a high magic setting. If your continent's shaped like a dragon, that tells you the kind of fantasy that we're talking about. Me, I'd rather make up my own worlds as I go along playing this sort of game, so I'm not hugely bothered by all of this information. But if you want a background, it's there, but it's not so detailed and so lore heavy that you'll feel that you're restricted in any way. The colour section is mostly nostalgia for previous editions. I think I have both of those editions with those covers, as well as this current one. Maps of the world and so on, if you're interested in that. This is kind of self-indulgent nostalgia, and that's fine. They're going to go into a bit more detail on a few different places. City of Terrors from the book. Then we get a few adventures here. So we get a solo adventure, which is a great thing to put dead characters through. In fact, that's what they suggest. So if your character dies, go play this game while the rest of us finish up the adventure. I always liked the way they divided up by number and letter. It made it easier to find sections, really. I'm sure it made it easier while creating them as well. So there's that you can play out. Then there's a more traditional adventure scenario. I'm kind of torn on adventure scenarios. To me, they often feel like a waste of space in game books for something that you're only ever going to use probably once. They're kind of useful in explaining to people how you want the game to be played, how you intend the game to be played, but I think I would rather have adventures as separate booklets rather than in the main book, because, that's a bunch of pages and a bunch of extra costs for printing, for shipping, and for me as the consumer in buying, that I'm just not that interested in. I mean, that's what, 50 pages, is it? Just under. So 40 something pages of stuff that I am almost certainly never going to use. That's almost 10%. It's about 10% of the book's content as a whole. That's a generic criticism that I have of a lot of games. I think there is value in showing people how you intend the game to be played, but for me, it's largely a waste of space. And I only ever begrudgingly include that kind of stuff in my own games, or where I feel that the setting is so different or unfamiliar to people that they need that kind of introduction. So then we got a weapons glossary with all kinds of illustrations, so you know what kind of weapons you're using. That's useful. I've always found visual reference really useful for weapons. And we have a really good index for everything else you might ever need to find. So let's give it a review score, shall we? You can still get a lot of the classic books. I would give it... See, it's hard to score because the artwork isn't necessarily very good, but it's very nostalgic and really takes you back to those kind of fanzine and home printed days. So it's kind of Marmite, you either love it or hate it, so I'll split the difference and give it 3 out of 5 for style. Substance, everything is here you would ever need to play Tunnels and Trolls, 5 out of 5. So add those together, that's 8, divide by 2, that's 4 out of 5. So a hearty recommendation. Now, Tunnels and Trolls is a bit odd. It's an old school game that hasn't been part of the old school renaissance because it's never been open source. It's never been open for anyone to create material for other than fan material that you give away for free. And it's never been retro-cloned because it's always been in publication and every edition is, broadly speaking, compatible with the previous edition because it hasn't needed to change. And yet you don't see a tremendous amount of love for Tunnels and Trolls in the OSR community. I think that's because the OSR community is very much about improvisation and recreation and remix and remodel, and you can't do that with a game that isn't open source and which hasn't been retro-cloned. But there's no need to retro-clone it because it's still in publication. The reason I think it hasn't gone open source to any extent, why it hasn't been opened up to people, I went and asked specifically for permission to do the material I did for TNT, and I have to send them a cut of the money, so it's not open. I think the reason they've been wary of opening up to other people to produce material quite so much, I think the reason they're gun shy of going open source is partly because of all RPGs. I think Tunnels and Trolls has probably suffered the most from piracy. Now, plenty of other games, plenty of other material will have been pirated. Yeah, you can find it on 4chan or whatever if you feel so inclined. I will admit to occasionally looking for downloads of out of print material that isn't on that hasn't been digitized and put on drive-through, and often, unfortunately, pirate scans are better quality, so sometimes when I buy something that's been scanned and it's low quality, I will go and look for a pirated version as well, because they do a better job of scanning and collating it. But of all games, I think Tunnels and Trolls has suffered the most from piracy. There is a person who I will not name because I don't want them getting attention or anything, but there is a person who seems to have made it their life's mission to rip off Tunnels and Trolls. So they copy material wholesale, they use stolen art on their covers, they use multiple accounts, different aliases, different print-on-demand services and PDF hosting services, and they're constantly selling stuff that isn't theirs to sell. So it wouldn't surprise me at all to find that Ken St. Andre and the others involved in Tunnels and Trolls are gun shy of opening up the game because they have suffered so much from piracy. So if you can afford to buy their material, please do, because it will support some genuinely lovely old school type people from back in the misty dawn of role playing, and help defeat the pirate there. It's unfortunate, but there you go. I do love the game. I haven't played it enough, as much as I would have wanted to. I did play the single player adventures to death back in the day. I'd like to write more fan material for it. I think maybe a science fiction setting or something. So maybe I'll be back in touch with Ken at some point in the future, and we'll see where we go. Zang.
Your habits, your facts, your fears. Give us your address, your shoe size, your years, your digits, your plans, your number, your eyes, your schedule, your desire.